Welcome to the Open Source Startup Podcast. I'm Robbie from Cowboy Ventures, and along with my awesome co-host, Tim from Essence VC, we are very excited today to have Armon, the co-founder and CTO of HashiCorp, on the podcast. And I hardly think HashiCorp needs an introduction. It is arguably one of the most admirable software infrastructure companies of the last decade, if not of all time, covering a lot of things around software infrastructure automation and security automation. And they went public last year. So welcome, Armon. We are very excited to have you on.
Oh, my pleasure. And thanks so much for making the time.
Awesome. So why don't we go way back to 2013, I think is where your history with HashiCorp starts, and really just talk us through what was going on at 2013. Where did you see the opportunity and why did you decide to join Mitchell and co-founding HashiCorp?
Sure. In some sense, actually, I need to go even further back to set the stage. Back to kind of circa 2007, me and Mitchell were on a University of Washington research project together. And at the time, this was super early days of Amazon, obviously. Like they had just launched EC2 and S3. Like those were the two services. And, people were still trying to figure out how to build things in cloud. And so same with us, we were on this research project at University of Washington, really trying to cut our teeth on like, how do you build sort of a distributed modern application on cloud? None of the tooling existed, but made sense. It was 2007. Flash forward a few years, and me and him end up working at a mobile ad tech business in the Bay Area. And, now it's circa 2011, and we're sort of solving all the same problems that we saw in 2007, which was like, there's really no easy ways to provision things in cloud. There's no way to scale up and down. Security is kind of a mess, right? And so we were kind of building a bunch of homegrown stuff at the ad network to solve those problems in Amazon. But it's not our core competency, right? Like we were really clear, like we're an ad network, but why do we spend 30% of our time on like cloud management software? And so we started just talking to a bunch of our peers, right? And we're like, GitHub was down the road and Slack was down the road and Stripe was down the road. And we were like, okay, what are you all doing? And everyone's answer was 20, 30% of our engineering is building undifferentiated cloud management tooling. And so once we kind of heard that over and over again, we're like, okay, there's clearly a problem here. Everyone's just rebuilding the same wheel. And so that's what brought us to say, 2013, maybe we should start HashiCorp and let's just build this stuff once and for all. At the time, I think the sort of environment we were soaked in, we felt like all of the real innovation in infrastructure was happening in open source. So we felt like it had to be an open source focused effort. Like you're not going to get very far with a proprietary solution. So we said, let's do it in open source. Let's really focus on building kind of a community around these tools. And really kind of drive the adoption of them. And then, we'll figure out how this is a business later. But, there's a clear and pressing problem, which is like everyone shouldn't be reinventing the same 3 or 4 wheels.
Yeah, I know there's so many iconic projects and, I think Terraform, Volt, and lots of things came out of that process. I think I actually want to go maybe first to talk about like the first project you worked on, because I think that seems to have taken quite a while, right? A lot of people... I know HashiCorp maybe not feel like the overnight success, but HashiCorp is like the iconic way of how open source now has been the way a lot of founders are imagining what their company is about. I want to be in HashiCorp for X. That has come out a lot. But I think not many people realize how long things take. Right. You can talk about like, what is the first project? What does it take to actually get it to be popular? What does the timeline look like? And what is like hard challenges in the early days too?
Yeah, it's so funny because I think, by definition, by the time someone comes to hear about our products, it's only after they're a success, right? Like, and so it always looks like it was overnight, but the reality is all of the projects almost were a slow burn, right? Like I think Vagrant is probably the most iconic because it predated the company. So Vagrant actually dates to 2009, a few years before the company was started. And at the time, it was just a project Mitchell made at university. He was solving, scratching his own itch around having to rebuild his development environment all the time. And, I tell this to every time I do our employee onboardings. In the first year that Vagrant existed, it did 100 downloads. 90 of them were me and Mitchell, right? Like that kind of gives you a sense. It's like, it wasn't these big communities. And then in the first maybe 2 years, it was just an incredible amount of boots on the ground evangelism. You kind of knew the first 1,000 users by name or face because you were talking to them on IRC. You met up with them at the Seattle meetup group or the Ruby meetup group, or, it was a Chef or Puppet meetup or whatever it was, or it was a local DevOps type conference. And so it was almost this one-on-one level of like, hey, you have that problem. Can I talk to you about Vagrant? Let me do a demo for you. And it was this very slow bootstrap where it's like, yeah, you went from like 100 downloads to maybe only a few thousand downloads the year after, right? And so slowly but surely that few thousand, you kind of get to, the magic number I think is about 10,000. You get to about 10,000 users and you start to see a little bit of like a self-fulfilling, the community is a self-evangelizing type of a thing. Right. But the first 1,000, the way we put it is it's by name and face. The other one that I think people are shocked to hear this about is we had multiple board conversations where they asked, should we kill Terraform? Right. And you think about that now, you're like, well, that seems insane. But Terraform for the first 2 years, if you looked at its adoption, was almost like a flat line. It looked like it was just on life support, basically. And it really wasn't until versions 0.4, 0.5, which were 2.5 years in, that you start to see even a little bit of like, an elbow to the flat line, right? And it wasn't a straight up line. You saw just a bit of like, oh, people are actually using this thing, right? And then it took another few years before we really started to feel like, okay, it's starting to build legs. So I think almost without exception, I'd say all of our products have been like that, where it's been a very long burn, 2 to 3 years before you really start to see an inflection point. I'd say the only exception to that was Vault, where I think Vault was like, within 6 months, you're like, you knew this thing was going to work. Everything else was a long burn.
That's so interesting because to Tim's point, from the perspective of someone looking back or a founder looking back at this point, it does seem like they just were released and took off. I guess then for probably mostly Terraform and Vagrant, if they weren't taking off initially, like what were you looking for to say, hey, like this has legs and there's like companies that could potentially pay us at some point or be valuable to us that are using it? Like what did you look for early on to just kind of give yourselves the encouragement that there is something here that is worth kind of like waiting multiple years to see momentum for?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think you asked it very diplomatically, which is like, it's like when you're staring into the abyss, what gives you hope? I think is maybe how I would put it. I think it's multiple things. I think on one hand, it helped that me and Mitchell were former practitioners, right? Like we were building products for ourselves in some sense, so it wasn't like we were building a product and then looking for the solution itself. You know what I mean? I think there's a lot of companies that go in that direction where it's like, hey, we built this cool Web3 thing. What can it be used for? Right? I don't think we did that. We started in the reverse. We started with the problem. So all of our products were built because we're like, hey, we felt firsthand for 5 years the pain of like, you need a provisioning tool and that thing has to be automated and that thing has to work in a certain way. And we built a version of that 3 different times. So we knew you needed a thing like that. So it wasn't, we always had conviction, I should say, in the problem space, if that makes sense. It didn't feel like we were chasing a problem that was of our own imagination. Like we knew it's a real problem. Then the second piece of it was, is this the right solution? That's a different question. The problem might exist, but is this the right solution? And I think part of that was you find the tastemakers that you trust. Right. So I think in any given market, there's the people who are the true tastemakers and kind of lead what other people end up doing. And then there's the people who are like, they only show up to the party after it's already like the default answer. And then, but they're not going to take a risk on the thing. So I think for us, it was spending a lot of time with the tastemakers, right? And we knew all of them by name and face and would spend time with them and, get the vocal people in the community. And so we'd get their feedback, and it wasn't always positive, right? It was like, no, this part of Terraform sucks, and this part of, Vagrant doesn't make any sense. But the fact that they're like, okay, there's a kernel of this thing, and like the things that they're complaining about are solvable. Okay, we can then go solve those over, in the case of Terraform, maybe it took us 2.5 years to get there, but it can be solved. They weren't like, this thing is fundamentally flawed. You know what I mean? So I think that's a part of it. And I think the third part of it is just, and this is the hardest one, is just like, you have to be a bit of a crazy person. I don't know. Like, you have to have an irrational belief that this is the right answer and have that conviction. Because if you're like, hey, I need the download number to go up hour by hour, otherwise I'm going to lose conviction, like you have a problem. right? Like this might not be the right line of business for you. So I think it was all of those three. I think we felt a really strong conviction that, like, yeah, you need a tool like Terraform because we felt this problem multiple times. We feel like Terraform is the right answer. And then we've talked to the tastemakers. That said, I'm not saying like we're some irrational people that hold on to the dogma that, it's the best thing. What people think about as Terraform today is actually our third attempt at Terraform. We had 2 previous attempts that we built, we thought was the right answer, spent time with tastemakers, spent time using it ourselves, and we're like, it's wrong, right? We got the abstraction wrong. We got the user experience wrong. Like, it's the wrong product, throw it away, try again, right? Consul, it's the second version of what people think about as Consul is actually what Consul is, right? So a lot of our products actually went through that. What you think you know of the product is actually not the first try of it. And I think that's an important part of it. So like, you have to have the conviction, but it can't be an irrational one. It can't be a terrible product and you're just lying to yourself.
Yeah, that's super interesting where there's a lot of truth to that, where you have to have conviction that the problem is so important for people, but then not so into the current solution that
Right.
you think it is right. And both of that's actually very hard, I realize. Because the hardest part, I think a lot of people don't understand is, of course, one is how long it takes, right? Like 2 to 3 years, multiple conversations, so many ways of doing it. Maybe one thing I'd like to ask is, during that process, maybe let's take Terraform as an example. 3 versions, 2 versions that didn't work. What was the signs that, things didn't work as planned, and that you have to rewrite? Because a lot of times, like, okay, maybe it's just immature. Maybe you just don't have enough templates or don't have enough plugins, right? You can always tell yourself, I'm not building enough features, right? And so I just keep doing more,
Right.
versus I actually need to rethink my approach here. Like, how do you tell the difference when it comes to building Terraform in that journey?
I'd say it's 2 things, right? And I'll speak to the 2 versions of Terraform before, because I think those are both good examples. The first stab we made at it was, I would call it, it was too inflexible, right? It was too opinionated. It was too inflexible. It was too high level. And so I think when we would use it ourselves, we would feel that, right? We would use the product and you're like, oh, I need to change this thing, or I need to customize this thing. And you start to realize like, oh, I can't. The product is sort of fighting me. And I'm quickly running into these edges where it's like, it's not that the product's missing a feature or that it's like, oh, that was just a bug that we could fix. It's like, oh, the design is constrained, right? Like there's no easy answer to it. And I think the flip side is when we put it in front of people and be like, hey, here's a demo, here's a POC. What do you think about it? Give us your feedback. It's, did you have good answers to their questions? When someone would see that demo and they're like, oh, okay, I got that. I get this thing, but now can you show me how I do it with WordPress or whatever? Could you be like, oh yeah, sure, that's missing this feature, but yeah, I could bang that out for you in an hour and then we could do it. Or you're like, oh, yeah, that's a good question. Let me get back to you in 3 weeks on like how that might work. Because I think those questions, someone else is going to ask you questions that maybe you won't ask because you're too in it, right? Like you're too deep in it, or you're only thinking about it through one lens, and then someone sees it through a different lens and you're like, oh, I never thought about it through that. And I actually don't have a good answer to it. And so I think the moment you don't have a good answer a few different times in a row, you're like, oh, there might be something deeper here, right? So that's, I think, a really good indication. So when we threw that away and said, okay, like, let's try again. Our second try, we swung the pendulum too far the other way. We made the system too configurable. We made it too low level, not opinionated enough. And all of a sudden, when we started using it, we're like, oh, this thing is really verbose and it's really complicated. And there's a lot of knobs you need to be turning. And I think that when you put it in front of people, their questions would now be the other side, where they're like, how is this easier than me just doing X? And when you see that question and someone's like, oh, like, they don't even see the value above and beyond, like literally just doing it themselves or whatever. Like the tool clearly isn't providing enough value above what they're doing, and you don't have a good answer to it. So I think it's those two. It's like, you have to use it, you have to feel it, right? There's a feel to it where you use it and you're like, oh, this thing feels right, or you're like, something's off. And then I think it's just putting it in front of people, getting their feedback, and then being like, if it's like, oh yeah, no, that's easy. I just need to add this module for you, or this template or whatever. those are easy answers. Those are the ones where you're like, okay, got it. I can solve that. So to me, it was those two. And it's the combination of like, when we got Terraform just right, the questions were easy. And to us, it felt right. Obviously, it's like it would crash every other time you tried using it. You're like, okay, there's clearly some like rough edges to it, but you're like, the shape of it's right.
So one question that always comes up with open source projects, like probably even any product, is how do I talk about this project? Right? Because I think early days when you just have a project, well, I know it's solving some problem. Well, right. I can't just always describe a problem. I also need to describe how I'm solving this problem. And the terminology engineers always come up with is always interesting. I would say it's always some kind of conceptual thing that only engineers understand. Maybe it's fine for infrastructure software, but I'm just curious, during the iterations, as you grew popularity, do you try to change how you describe to people what Terraform is to make people more easily able to understand or even like tell other friends what this is? And how do you iterate on those ways of describing or your messaging, basically, on the project?
It's a very good question. And I think we go through phases with each of the products because the messaging evolves over time, because I think you need a different message at different phases. So let me kind of use an example with Terraform. Where we started with Terraform was, we called it, an infrastructure as code provisioning tool. Today, if I use that messaging, you're like, yeah, makes sense. No questions asked. The problem is in 2014, when I said it's an infrastructure as code provisioning tool, people are like, what's infrastructure as code? So the moment you said IAC, you already lost them. They were like, I don't know what that is, and I don't care anymore. And so, which is an interesting problem, because you're like, how do you describe Terraform to someone without describing infrastructure as code? It's so fundamental to the product that it's like, how do you get around that? And so I think, this was a tough one for us. So I think we tried that and we're like, okay, it doesn't work. And so we actually had to go back and simplify and connect it to a problem people do understand, which is like, it's about provisioning. So it became actually the simplest way to automate provisioning, because then people could relate to it. They're like, okay, I know I have a provisioning problem. I want to automate it. If you say it's simple, let me take a try. And then along the way, what we had to do is actually educate the community on what infrastructure as code is. So I could, if I went through, I could probably find it. I probably have done, I don't even want to know, is the answer 50 conference talks about what is infrastructure as code, right? Like it's almost so basic that you're like, you probably don't even believe I did this many talks about it. But you had to go educate a whole market about what is infrastructure as code. You start by describing Terraform as an easy provisioning automation tool. But now we don't describe it that way. We're just like, Terraform is the infrastructure as code tool. That's it, period, full stop. And everyone just knows what that means. Vault was the same problem. When we started with Vault, we said, it's secret management made easy. Okay, again, that makes sense to you today. But at the time when we said secret management, nobody knew what the hell we were talking about. Right? So you had to actually explain to people, like, what is a secret? Seems basic, but you're like, what is a secret? You're like, well, your database username and password is a secret. Your Amazon key is a secret. Your certificate is a secret. What does it mean to manage those things? So it was, we started at what we wanted to describe the products, realized that was wrong, and then you kind of go and revisit it and say, okay, what are the basic primitives I need people to understand before, right? Before you get to IAC, or before you get to secret management, or with Consul before you get to service networking. If I tell you it's about service networking, okay, today people understand service mesh and this and that. Nobody knew what the hell we were talking about in 2013. So I think with all of them, my point would be, we started with what we thought it was, message tested that, figure out what are the things people don't understand, and then, okay, how do I replace that with something they can relate to, or there's an analogy to what they're currently doing? And then there's a huge amount of effort around education around that market category. Let me define service networking. Let me define secret management. Let me define infrastructure as code. And then as that market kind of flips and people get it, then your messaging eventually converges to whatever you thought it should be probably the first time around. But again, it goes to your point, like, this is not overnight. It's like, I probably had to tell people what infrastructure as code was till, I was blue in the face for 5 years.
It's so interesting. And I love the focus on educating the market, because again, I think that looking back, it seems like it was inevitable that infrastructure as code was going to be a thing. But I think probably when you first came out with that terminology, it really wasn't that obvious. And I wanted to ask kind of a similar question where now I think it's become such a de facto go-to-market / way to build an open source for developer tools. But back in like 2013, 2014, it wasn't as obvious. And I imagine when you were like talking to investors or just talking to folks about having an open source business, it wasn't like, oh, that makes total sense. Like there were probably a lot more questions. So what was it that gave you conviction? Maybe it was like other projects, seeing how those took off, or like other tastemakers. Like what were those things that gave you conviction before it was as obvious as it is today?
Yeah, no, great question. And it was the it was the polar opposite of like a sensible, safe thing to do at the time. I think the average investor we talked to looked at us like we were crazy people. They're like, you're going to build products and give them away for free. Okay, next. So I think it was a few things. How we actually got conviction was like, again, goes back to me and Mitchell. We're sort of steeped in these environments, right? We were sort of in it, doing it ourselves. Like we were building infrastructure tools, not as part of, it wasn't our focus as part of the ad network, but we had to do it to support the business. And so in that community, what was clear is that everybody was building an open source, right? Airbnb would build a thing. They would release that thing as open source. Google was building, a bunch of their stuff. That was all open source. And so where Chef and Puppet were open source, right? So a lot of what was happening in that infrastructure DevOps community was happening in open source. And so as people who were in that community were talking to all of these DevOps and platform teams that were adopting this stuff, it was clear that they were only going to adopt other open source solutions, right? Because they wanted to be able to solve their own problem. Cloud was evolving so quickly that you needed the ability to make changes and modify to support things as Amazon would release new capabilities. So we were so in it that it was almost inconceivable to us that another approach would even work. We were like, you wouldn't be able to get the mind share of the developers and the end users who are in this community because that's just how they're already working. So for us, it just felt really obvious. I think the other thing that was really helpful, again, was Vagrant. So Vagrant started open source in 2009. By the time we got to circa 2012, 13, Vagrant was already a relatively successful project. It continued to grow after that point, but it was still had a sizable user base, did a lot of downloads. And so that was the fact that motion had worked, and we're like, hey, there's this big community of people that use and contribute to Vagrant, kind of highlighted that, yeah, there's going to be this developer-led ability to build these businesses, and that's the logical start place for us rather than saying, let's go start with proprietary. And then on the investor side, honestly, the hard part was, as the saying goes, it doesn't matter how many people say no, we just needed one person to say yes. And I think we found, particularly with Mayfield, they did our Series A, a group of people that were, particularly Robin Vasson, came from very much, he was an ex-engineer, understood this background, spent a ton of time on GitHub and understood the open source kind of community. And so I think they got it and they were like willing to take that bet that like, yeah, this next generation of developer company will be open source. But a dozen plus other venture firms weren't willing to make that bet.
It's crazy comparing it to the kind of like startup venture ecosystem today, where open source is very much just accepted as the way to build. And there's a lot of, I'd say, like investor patience and employee patience around, okay, we're not going to monetize right away. Like this is the way we're going to build. But I guess back then, how did you think about prioritization and saying like, no, we need to focus on the community and making them successful and not necessarily figuring out how to like squeeze money from them? Like, how did you actually figure out what to prioritize? Because you didn't have that many examples to look to.
No, you really didn't. I think it's all about expectation setting. And I think we were very clear when we were doing our Series A that we're like, we need you to leave us alone for 2 years to just go build open source and focus on the community. Like we promise we'll come back and care about what the business is, but for 2 years, you just got to leave us alone. And that was a very explicit part of it. So there wasn't a mismatch of expectations, right? And I think some of the venture folks opted out because they were like, I think we had people tell us straight up, you should just abandon all of your other things. Like Vagrant's working, just double down and be the Vagrant company. Multiple people told us that. Right. And so those people, it was mutual on both sides. Like, well, we don't want to work with you because you don't get it. And you don't want to work with us because you think we don't get it. So that's fine. So I think it was about being really clear on that expectation setting. And so I think true to their word, I think our investors, they got it. And we told them, hey, for 2 years, we're just going to go focus on this stuff. And they gave us that time to actually go out and do a build and go focus on sort of building community and open source, and they had that patience, right? I think, 2 years and a week, they literally sent us the email being like, okay, what's HashiCorp the business, not HashiCorp the well-funded research project, but we got the 2 years.
Yeah, I imagine that will be a very stressful conversation during the time. But what does the conviction come from that I know this is the right way to do it? Because obviously you have so many people who tell you, like, hey, you're a business, right? Open source, no precedence of this worked out this way, right? I know the trajectory of the growth definitely is probably one of the signals that really made the belief. But what other things you've believed that should happen those 2 years that made us a much better chance for us to monetize much later, that give you that, okay, this is actually a much more better alternative, rather than maybe in 6 months, let's just try to, build consulting and support. You're
Right.
probably already doing some of that, but it's just that conviction definitely come from somewhere. I just wonder how you got to that point.
Yeah. What I think it was, and it wasn't because in the early years, it's not like there was that much broad adoption, right? Like not like it is today. I think it was having the right early adopters, right? So like I think back to, super early days. I think one of the first adopters of Hacker was PayPal. One of the first adopters of Consul was eBay, right? Like one of the first adopters of Terraform was Groupon, and pre-implosion. And so I think with each one of those, we spent a bunch of quality time with them. And I think each of those were teams that had very smart, very sophisticated, very well-staffed platform engineering teams, right? Like, it wasn't like PayPal was like 3 people in a garage. They had huge platform and infrastructure teams. And the fact that they were like, oh yeah, this seems like the right solution. We're going to abandon the homegrown thing we built to use this open source project and contribute to that thing. That gives you a lot of, they might be one user, but they're one user that's a very discerning user, right? And they're one very well-resourced user that's like, if they thought it was a crappy thing, they just wouldn't use it. They would go build their own thing, right? So I think that was some of the fact that you had some of these early folks adopting it and starting to use it at real scale, even though it was very early and they were contributing to it. And it was sort of like, they got that it was these are alpha grade, beta grade, early open source. But the fact that they were willing to engage with it, I think that's what gave us the feeling that you're like, okay, we must be doing something right. You know what I mean? Like we're not so far off base that it's like the only person using it is like the one, super fanboy in their basement or something. It's like, there's real people, real organizations that are using this stuff. So I think that's a big part of it, I think.
I'm curious about how you mentioned actually going and spending time with some of the early users, but what are the specific things that you did to work with them and make sure that what you were building was exactly what they wanted and would adopt? Like, was it a lot of seeing how many issues came in and using that as like a form of judgment, or like what were just like the specifics that you look for? Because I think a lot of that would even be relevant today. And there are a lot of open source companies that Tim and I talk to who it's just so hard in the early days to judge like how you're doing. So like, are there any kind of other specifics that you looked at?
In some sense, I think a lot of it's, yeah, I mean, you look at a bunch of different signals. So it's like, the easy ones, let's talk about those, which is like, there's the quantitative stuff, which is like, you look at your GitHub stars, you look at downloads, you look at website traffic, and you can kind of see different trends there. But again, going back to my point, is like things like Terraform were kind of flat. So it's not always a good indicator, but it's helpful to see like, is there a pulse, right? Is it trending at all? Right. Or where am I in the curve? Am I in that flat part? Is it starting to elbow? Have I figured out some product market fit? Right. Like, it tells you something quantitatively. Then I think a lot of it was actually more qualitative. And I think that was where it's like, you're going to lunch with these users, right? And you're just like, hey, tell me about how you're using Vault. What are the problems you have with it? Like, are there other problems you could solve with it? Like, what are your other security problems that are adjacent? And your job is almost the head product manager. I mean, that's what it is. Like you're a PM and you're out there and you're just sort of spending a bunch of quality time with them to understand like, what are the sharp edges? Like, what do you need to have the next 20 users using this thing? And I think you learn a tremendous amount with those early users, right? And they really help shape the product direction and features and your priority roadmap, because you don't have enough quantitative data to guide a roadmap. So you almost have outsized influence talking to those first 5, 10 early adopters. And some of it you can be over pattern matching, right? And I think that's a risk. We've done some of that in the early days where it's like, oh, we kind of went and solved this thing. Oh, it turned out that was specific to this one customer. That's a risk in those early days, but that's okay. Like, because you're smaller and agile and, it's okay to do some of that stuff. And part of it's like you're exploring, like you don't know what the right answer is. Like maybe that was the right answer and you tried and you're like, okay, that wasn't the right answer, but maybe this other thing is the right answer. So I think a lot of it is just spending the quality time with the end users just to understand their issues and what they would want from the product. And I think that's a big thing, is just like when they give you the signal of like, oh, if only it did X, then we could use it to solve Y. And once you've heard that a few times, you're like, oh, okay, actually, yeah, the product could do X. And it seems like most of our users actually have Y as a problem. And, great, let's go expand and do that. But it is more qualitative, frankly, than it is quantitative at the super early. We're talking, this is super early phase, right?
I want to shift gear a little bit to talk about the team building side. So now HashiCorp is focused on adoption, right? Really trying to figure out how to get all the projects to be widely adopted. I think a lot of open source companies are in a similar mode early days, but what's harder for most founders is trying to figure out like how to even build the team. Yep. Should we get DevRel first day? What should they do? Should I get a content person? Should I get a community person? Does every engineer just sit in a garage and just build code? Or should they all be like you and doing everything outbound? Like, how did you evolve the team? And was there any particular culture elements of engineers even, or any team member did you hire has to have certain aspects to it because that can fit sort of HashiCorp way of operating?
Good question. And maybe there's almost 2 or 3 different, I think, embedded questions there. So, maybe just talking about like the early sequencing of hires, the first hire outside of me and Mitchell was an engineer. The second hire was a developer evangelist. And the third hire was, for better or worse, was the business person. It was everything else. And I think that person came in eyes wide open. It's like, hey, you're going to think about everything from our websites to our marketing to our pricing and packaging to bill payment processing, right? So I think that person came in knowing they were going to be a generalist. And then I think hires 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 were probably all engineering. So very, very early was sort of like you need someone who's thinking about the non-eng and you need someone focused on DevRel. And then probably of the rest of the first 10, the rest of it was all engineering basically. So maybe that kind of gives a sense of maybe that first 10, 12 people is sort of what that composition looked like. In terms of the hiring, we had a massive disposition towards hiring from our own open source communities. So of the first, 10 engineers, I'm trying to think, were all of them out of our own open source community? Probably. Maybe with the exception of one. Because I think what that feedback loop that was so helpful is like, these are people you're already engaging with because you're talking to them on IRC or over GitHub or over email or whatever. And so you kind of know their working style, the quality of their work because you've already been doing code reviews and things like that. So it massively de-risked the hire, and they're naturally passionate about the problem space, right? If these are, for a lot of the people, it was sort of nights and weekend, like, hey, I think this is kind of a cool project. Like they were so early, nobody was using any of the stuff at work. So it's like you were naturally screening for people that were passionate about the project. And honestly, even up to, I don't know, maybe as much as like our 30th, 40th engineering hire, we were probably still doing that. At a certain point, you stop being able to kind of just poach out of your own. And so you don't want every one of your users to be an employee. So it's like you have to stop doing that eventually. But for a ton of, it was the first 30, 40, 50 people, it probably was heavily weighed out of our open source community. So that's piece one. Then the second part of it was, I think, the kind of cultural traits we screened for. And that was very, very important to us. I talk about it sometimes. It's like my first experience working in industry was so scarring that I decided not to work in industry and to become an academic. So the reason I actually moved to the Bay Area was to go to Cal. Because I actually went full 180 the other degree. I'm like, I don't even want to work in industry. I'm just going to be in the ivory tower. And so to me, that really then, and ultimately I had a good experience at the mobile ad tech company and then, with HashiCorp. And so to me, it was really, really important that we shaped the culture in a very intentional way, because I was like, I'd seen what it was like on the other side where I was like, wow, it was so bad that I wouldn't want to work there. And I just assumed that all of industry was like that, which thankfully it's not. But we were very intentional about what's the cultural norms we want to set. So actually, we publish it now on our website. It's called The Principles of HashiCorp. But we basically had that as an internal document from pretty much the very beginning. And that was our internal rubric of like what culture fit was. It was like, if they abide by these principles of HashiCorp, we define that as culture fit. Like they're kind of one and the same. And I think we placed a really strong emphasis on kindness, which I think is unusual. You don't see that in a lot of like corporate, principles or culture fit docs or whatever. But it was like, for us, it was like, yeah, it's like, if I'm spending 10 hours of a day with these people, it's like, why do I want to deal with a bunch of assholes? So it's like, kindness was super important. Humility was super important, right? Particularly in open source, you get people whose, heads don't fit through a double wide door, right? And that was not the culture we wanted. And I think the third one was actually pragmatism. Again, very unusual. And I think particularly in open source, you get people who are willing to die on every hill. So, I think we really were intentional about people who are like, come here and be passionate about the problem. Do not be passionate and tied to your solution because it could be wrong. And so that requires a level of humility and it requires a level of pragmatism to say, you know what? Yeah, this was wrong. We're going to throw it away and we're going to try again, because what I care about is getting the problem right, not the solution. And so it was a very specific hiring criteria. And I think it served us well, because I saw a lot of our competitors and peers where, they didn't have that, or they had a much more dogmatic culture. And frankly, they were willing to go down with the ship, and they did go down with the ship because they were more tied to the product than they were about getting the problem right.
This is going to bring us a little bit closer to today, but since we're talking about team and humility, a lot of folks who work at HashiCorp really praise you for kind of bringing Dave in, and that's not something that's easy for a lot of founders to do. And so I'd love to just hear your perspective on that decision, because I think also, like, open source or not, it's hard for a lot of founders to always think about what's like the right thing to do for the company, and in open source also the community, as opposed to what will just kind of keep them in power. So I just would love your kind of thoughts on how that happened and what your and Mitchell's thought processes were.
Yeah, it's a good question. And probably, I would say both the hardest and yet best decision I think we made. I think with the moment it really dawned on us was sort of called 4 years in. We, for a long time, didn't know who our customer was. It was sort of, the answer was everybody. And I think through a process of sort of going through a bit of a soul search, we sort of came to the conclusion, like, you know what, when we grow up, we want to be an enterprise business, right? Like, we want to be VMware 2.0. We don't want to be Heroku 2.0. And so, we made that decision. We sort of talked to the board and said, we're gonna focus in on enterprise as our target segment. And they were like, okay, great. Yeah, we understand the reasoning and logic. Go for it. And then, I think as me and Mitch sort of worked through, okay, well, what does that mean though? Like, now we have to go build an enterprise sales force. Now we have to, do our positioning and messaging in a different way that's enterprise oriented. Now we have to go build an enterprise product. What became really clear is that it's like, me and Mitchell have never sold to an enterprise. We've barely worked for an enterprise, and we've never built an enterprise business, right? So certainly as the founders and CEO, right, like, you have the, I'll call it, moral authority to go do that, right? Like, you could go learn it and do it and sort of stay in that position. But our view was, how many mistakes are we going to make along the way? 1,000 might be a generous undercount, but let's say 1,000. What are the chances that that 1,000 mistakes is existential to the business, right? And the answer is high. And so we looked at it and said, okay, what if we brought in sort of adult supervision, but somebody who understands open source, somebody who's going to understand enterprise, someone who's been there, done that before. No one's going to be perfect. I think that's an unrealistic expectation. But instead of 1,000 mistakes, might they make 50? And that delta 950, is that going to be the difference between success and failure for the business? And so I think that was sort of our mental rationale for this. Ultimately, I think we had to ask ourselves a very important question, and every founder has to ask the question, which is, what's more important to you, the CEO title or the success of the business? Because depending on your answer to that, there might be two very different paths you should take. And I think what was clear to me and Mitchell was like, it wasn't the CEO title. You're like, I don't care what my title, it could be chief janitorial officer, like whatever. What mattered to me was the success of the product, the company, the ideas. That was more important. So we said, okay, let's set aside our ego of whatever the title is. What's the right answer for the business? Is probably to bring in someone experienced who knows what they're doing, right? Obviously easier said than done. The biggest risk, the biggest heartburn, I think, frankly, was you're giving up a major part of control of the company. The CEO obviously has major say on strategy, direction, execution, culture. And in fact, the pieces that were most important to us were actually some of the culture stuff. Because I don't think we had strong opinions on like, what should our sales execution look like? I don't know. We were figuring it out. We were first-time founders. So it was not like I had strong views of that. What we had strong views about like was the product direction and the culture of the company, not necessarily what our positioning or pricing or sales strategy should be. It's like, great, we're open to exploring whatever those are. So I think the biggest thing for us to get comfortable with as we went through a CEO search and then ultimately sort of bringing Dave on board was that, are we aligned culturally, right? That we want to run the company in the same way. And are we going to enter this in the spirit of partnership? Meaning, are we hiring our boss or are we bringing in a third founder, right? And I think that's a very different thing, right? And I think I feel very lucky is that Dave feels very much like a third co-founder, right? Like, and he very much deferred to me and Mitchell on product vision, strategy, and very much brought his point of view on how do we build a business? What should the go-to-market look like? But it was always a partnership. It was never him telling us. It was, hey, here's what I think we should do. What do you think? Right. And so I think that's a really, really important piece of that, but it's hard, right? It was the hardest decision by far because it's your baby and you're sort of, you're handing it off.
And I really like how you word it. It's like, do you want the success of the company or just hold on to the title? I kind of wanted to take this point even further because, we all read the blog post from Mitchell, right? And, I think there's a lot more personal journey that goes on as your company grows, right? I'm very curious because not very few founders was able to walk through that long of a journey, all the way to beginnings, IPO, and, still continue on. I guess what is the biggest sort of soul searching or challenge you find, because when I read Mitchell's blog post, it talks about like he's finding what gives him joy, like what he really likes to do and goes back towards, right? When you build a company, there's so many things you have to learn and do, and you kind of get used to it, a lot of things like that nature. I just wonder, maybe on your side, like what is your process of personally either enjoy or not enjoy? Like what are the things you found to start enjoying or keep motivating you? Or what are still things you still find fairly challenging? Is it all easy or not? I'm just curious, what does that journey might look like? And maybe it's a very open-ended question, but I'm just curious on your side, what does that journey might look like and continue to find a motivation to keep doing this?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it's I'd say it's probably one of the hardest things a founder will go through. And I joke about it all the time. It's like, you found a deep tech infrastructure company because you're passionate about deep tech and infrastructure, and you wake up and realize your job has nothing to do with that, right? Like, I joke that the T in CTO is for therapy, right? It's not for technology. And so, I think it's a really interesting question, right? Because obviously the original motivations were very much, me and Mitchell were both neck deep in the code and sort of highly technical co-founders. But over time, what you end up realizing is that's not what the business needs, right? Like, yeah, that's what it needed when you were the first 5 people, but very quickly it's not, right? Like your job becomes chief evangelist or it's chief, you're the head product manager or you're the head salesperson or you're the main SE or whatever it is, right? Like your job constantly evolves. And so I think it goes back to a number of things, which is like, again, it's like, where are you going to get your energy and passion from? And I think for me personally, it was always like, how do I help the company succeed? Right. And many times that means doing things that were not particularly fun, right? Like I get no particular joy out of, when my job was running payroll. that was not a joy fulfilling activity for me, right? Or, dealing with expense reports or whatever, right? But, you had to do it because it was like, that's what you needed to make the business function. And so you did it, right? And so I think where you have to always figure out like, what are the things along the way that you do get joy out of? And I think for me, as I've grown, and I'm always apologizing to my team because I'm sure I'm not the world's greatest manager, right? Like it's more like I do it because I have to, not because it's necessarily my joy. I love spending time with the customers. It's always fun to understand their use cases, to see that aha moment in them, whether it was the first open source user and you see their aha moment, or whether now it's it's an enterprise customer. For me, that's always exciting because you're helping them solve a problem. You're helping them see the world in some sense in a different way. It's like they were stuck in one way of doing it and they're like, oh, wow, there's actually this different way that we could automate and think about infrastructure. And when you see that light go off, like that's deeply rewarding, right? So I think that part of it's fun. I think the other piece that's fun is you get to just see a bigger, your scale impact is very different. Like I can only do so much if I'm two hands on a keyboard. But if I can help a team of 200 people or 500 people or 2,000 people, do their role better and sort of see the mission come to life, then that's deeply rewarding for me too. It's like we get to HashiConf and you're on stage and you're announcing all this stuff and that's like, okay, well, 1 or 10 or 50 people couldn't have done it. It took, a big team to come together and deliver that. And so those are the moments that are sort of, rewarding. But it's definitely a big personal evolution, right? And I think me and Mitchell took him in very different paths. Mitchell decided to go and stay much closer to the code. And I think you see it on GitHub very starkly. If you look at Mitchell, it's like he almost hasn't missed a day, right, on his activity, timeline. And if you look at mine, it looks like I died, right? So they're very different, I think experiences of what it means to be sort of a CTO or a founder. But that's okay, right? I think there's different paths to it.
I think that's a really good place to end. I know I speak for Tim and I when this was one of the conversations we were most excited to have on the podcast. So we were very honored that you were willing to spend time with us. And we wanted to spend maybe 1 or 2 minutes at the end, making sure that you could mention HashiConf, which is coming up early October, I believe, right?
Yeah, exactly. So for folks that want to attend in person, it'll be in LA first week of October, and it should be a lot of fun. I'm glad it's back in person after a few years. And then for folks that might want to just dial in virtually, it's free. You can just register, and all of the main keynotes and stuff will do a live stream, and then everything will be recorded afterward as well. So yeah, it should be a good time if you're interested in any of the products or just want to see what's new in Hashi land. That's sort of our flagship event.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Armon. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for making the time.